If everybody could please find their seats, I'd like to get this meeting started. This is the Facilities Committee for the Board of Governors. Mikey, would you call the roll, please?
I'd be happy to. Your Vice Chair is Mr. Colson.
Here.
Mr. Martin. Mr. Perez.
Here.
Mr. Stavros.
Here.
Mr. Temple.
Here.
Dr. Yost.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Everybody has been given the minutes of the last meeting. I'd like to have a motion to approve the minutes of our last committee meeting, please.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The minutes are approved. If y'all will remember, Vice Chairman Colson at our last meeting asked that we take a look at PICO, and so we've got a presentation that'll be next that is going to give us a view of where PICO is headed. I know there's been a lot of interest in this. There's been a lot of discussion around the state whether PICO funding will continue to give the university system what it needs for its future growth. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Kinsley of our staff. And Chris, would you start, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, board members, members of the audience. The board has looked at this issue in the past and with PICO, but it's probably been since the 06-07 year that we've really taken an in-depth look at some of the key drivers behind PICO. So I thought I'd start with some background about our system and our facilities. One thing that people may not realize is that how large the system is. As a state agency, we not only would be the biggest state agency, we'd be bigger than all the other state agencies combined in terms of gross square feet. We have over 40 million feet of instructional space. Of course, only about 6% of that is classroom space. The rest consists of the things that universities do, the research labs, the teaching labs, the libraries, the offices, the various campus support space, not the athletics, not the dorms, not those type of things, but the things that you have to run a state university system. Most of our facilities are older. The average age is 28 years. It's valued at $14 billion replacement cost by the state's formula for calculating the value of the buildings. Just to give you some idea of the scale of it, our utility bills run about $150 million a year. The system as a whole has held that line. It was $150 million in 07-08, and we've added quite a bit of square footage since then. So I think the system, and we saw the energy report last year, and we'll be doing that report again this year. So we are trying, but that gives you some scale, just the utility bills alone. And finally, we received last year $14 million to do the significant renovations and remodeling on that $14 billion worth of space. That's 0.1%. General rule of thumb estimates are you need to spend somewhere between 1, 2, up to 3% to maintain your facilities. We're spending about 0.1%. Obviously, that's not going to be enough over time. Here's some more background. We share PICO. PICO is the funding source for the state university system and the college system. It's not as significant. It maybe makes up about 20% typically for the K-12 system. We are, over time, the university system is the green line, and over time, over the last 20 years, our share of PICO has risen from 20 to about 40%. So as a percentage, that's good. We'll talk about the bad news in a second. Talk a little more about PICO. It was established in 1963 for higher educational only via a constitutional amendment. With that came the authority to bond out the proceeds to leverage, because, of course, at that time in the 60s, the state of Florida and the higher education system was rapidly expanding, and that was the only way to build the facilities we needed. It was amended to include K-12. The PICO system and PICO bonding is rock solid. It is AAA bond ratings. It's got the highest rating from all three rating agencies as of recently as August 9th. So that's following this, where some other states and some other programs were downgraded, we were not. In fact, I think we were actually taken off of negative outlook watch outlook and went to stable. So actually, it was a positive. Classroom space, the system is already fairly efficient. Our old factor was 12 net square feet per student. We reduced that last year to 11.5 in terms of what a typical student, typical program would need. Actually, though, even though that's our standard, we only have 10.6. So our standard, what we say we need, is actually higher than what we actually have. But just to say we're trying to be efficient, overall, for all space types, we've also reduced the factor there. So we are making efficiency gains. Here's the slide I wanted to spend a good bit of time on, and this is the real crux. So that's some background. Now we'll look forward. And what we see, the red line is historical appropriations to the university system in millions of dollars. And we all know this story, I believe. 06, 07, 07, 08, 08, 09 were record-breaking years for our system. And we were in very good shape. We did a lot of good projects. Those are the projects that you see each year as I do the completed projects presentation. I think we see some of the fruits of the evidence of that here at FIU. Revenues fell dramatically in 9-10. We see that spike in 2010-11. That was a 0.15 shift in the communications services tax. It was a net neutral tax shift that generated some capacity to bond and got us back to more of a historical level. Last year, we see the big decrease to a historic low of $54 million. And then looking forward, if the program continues as it has in years past, the blue line is the current revenue estimate. That's cash and bonds. If we have cash only and we operate as a strictly pay-as-you-go system, there's the green cash-only line, and you can see that's just not a sustainable number for the system. And over time, it continues that way. It doesn't improve. So if we can operate the system as we've had in the past, we're at a fairly historic level between $350 million. We can move forward. At that, the cash-only level of funding, that $20 and $30 million, we'll be hard-pressed just to maintain and keep operational the 40 million gross square feet of space we currently have. Forget any new projects or any significant renovations. I want to talk a little bit about the PICO revenues. The two primary sources of PICO are taxes. They're a tax on electricity called the gross receipts tax and a tax on communication services such as wireless telephones, cable TV. A portion of that, about 2/3 of that communications tax goes into general revenue. The balance goes into gross receipts PICO. And looking at this, you can see that there was a decline in the last few years. The electricity component has recovered. This year it's projected to recover and exceed the pre-recession levels. The CST tax is recovering, but not as robustly as the electricity. That's primarily driven by, we believe, and I'm not an expert on this, but people canceling their landline services or looking to scale back their cable TV services. But it is projected to recover. So the PICO revenues, in terms of experiencing a severe decline, I think the worst is behind us. The question is how quickly and how rapidly will the revenues rebound. So last year, legislature appropriated $137 million. The governor only approved $57.3 million. The rest was vetoed. This related to capacity concerns. Hopefully, those concerns have been alleviated. We'll find when the next debt report comes out for the state, we'll see. But per the last report, the state benchmark debt ratio peaked at 7.91. The state's target is 6. The limit is 7. So we're over our limit. But the projection is that's going to fall below 7% for the upcoming budget year, the 12-13 year. So my hope is, from strictly a financial viewpoint, that we have gotten through the worst of the decline in the revenues, so capacity should continue to increase. Of course, some of that is dependent on the state operating budget continuing to increase, but right now things look if not favorable, at least not negative on the state revenue outlook. Tax Watch put out a report. I want to do a couple of slides on this, and I think it emphasizes the value of the PICO system. And you can see Tax Watch recognized how important to our public institutions PICO was, that everything cannot be done at the local level. And we need these PICO funds desperately, not only for new facilities, but to maintain the existing plant and educational stock. One thing I just want to emphasize again, PICO is the capital fund source for the state university system. I think it's easy for the general public sometimes to overlook. They see us constructing parking garages and housing and even athletic facilities, forgetting that those aren't paid with PICO whatsoever. Those are self-financed projects, and we say that at every board meeting, but it's very important to emphasize. In terms of educational space and keeping the educational space up, PICO is all we really have. There is not another source. And then this gets to my previous slide. Tax Watch emphasized some of the concerns about the PICO program. PICO is the state's largest debt program, and there was concerns about the state's debt limit. However, that appears to have been addressed. Also, and I've emphasized this, the however unlikely. And just to say that, based on the conservative forecast of the Revenue Estimating Conference, it's very unlikely that there is going to be that dramatic decline in the PICO tax base. I mean, people have to use electricity, and people are going to continue to have wireless communication devices. So yes, there could be a decline. We saw, but I think the worst of the decline is behind us. So I want to just emphasize, as a board, we follow reasonably prudent, conservative budget practices. We take the estimates that are provided to us by the Economic and Demographic Estimating Conference and that are validated by the Department of Education. It's not a worst-case scenario. We do not budget based on the absolutely worst-case scenario. It's just a reasonably conservative, prudent approach. What have we done? And this gets back to Vice Chair Colson's question. I can tell you, and Ken Jessel is going to come up in a minute and talk about the university perspective. As staff, we have met with the CAFA group. We've met with the physical plant directors and came forward with a few recommendations for the board to consider. One is we're going to refine our data collection reporting. We already have forms where universities tell us what their deferred maintenance needs are and requests are for the upcoming 5 years, but we've refined that process to make those even better estimates and more capture the data in a more sophisticated manner. The university have asked that we fund their 2012 PICO utility infrastructure as requested, and as we move forward to the budget agenda item, you'll see that we have funded at 80% of the requested level for each institution. For the next year, they've asked that we consider revising our methodology and have it, rather than it being on a university request basis, that it be based on some type of formulation that would consider the gross square footage, the age factor, as we do with our renovation remodeling, that we also do something very similar to PICO utility infrastructure and have a revised methodology. And lastly, that we get third-party verification of our PICO needs. The universities believe we've calculated ourselves. Our estimate is that we really, in a perfect world, we need about between $200 and $250 million each year to maintain our facilities in a good condition. But we think it would be very important and help if we could get third-party verification and validation of our methodology and our data on this. And with that, that is the background on PICO. Mr. Chair, I can take any questions now, or we can have Dr. Jessel come up.
Why don't we go ahead and have Dr. Jessel come up and do his presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers afterward, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Ken Jessel, Vice President for Financial Affairs at FIU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Florida International University. We are very happy to be your host for these 2 days of very deliberate meetings. I am doing this brief presentation on behalf of the Council of Administrative and Financial Affairs, the CAFA group. It's a joint effort, but I think that the voice is one. I think our voice is your voice. We recognize all that you do each and every day, each and every year as volunteers and as the Chancellor and his staff in working with the legislature and the governor to do everything possible to make the state university system the best in the nation. So what we'll be talking about is music to your ears, I am sure, but we want to make sure that you understand that we will be with you as you make these arguments to the legislature, as you make these arguments to the governor, that PICO is indeed a very, very high priority, not just for the state university system, but really for the state of Florida. One of the myths out there is that universities really don't need that much PICO. We don't see, a lot of growth. Things are bad. You can live with what you have. And what we want to give you is some points to articulate the things that you already know, is that we must continue with a strong, active PICO program for the state university system. So I'm only going to be focusing on these 4 points. The first is increased access to qualified students. The reductions in plant operations and maintenance funding that we have had as a state university system. The increase in deferred maintenance costs and issues at each of our institutions. And finally, one item that's often overlooked, and that is that the facilities that we have really have economic lives that are significantly less than the useful life of the facilities, the functional utility aspect of facilities. If we look at the first point, increased access to qualified students, there is no doubt that an educated workforce is essential to the well-being of the state of Florida. It is critical to the expansion of our economic base. Indeed, the first 2 goals of the state university system work plan deal with degree production. The first is access and production of degrees, and the second goal of the SUS is meeting statewide professional and workforce needs by awarding degrees in the areas of strategic emphasis. Since 2007-8, the state university system has provided access to approximately 30,000 additional students. This is a combination of new students and, importantly, improvements in our retention rates at each of the SUS institutions. That's about a 10% increase over that time period, and certainly 30,000 students is the equivalent of a large university. So that's what we've added since 2007, 2008 as a system. We've been doing this at a time when we have not received enrollment growth funding for new students from the legislature. And indeed, we've been doing it at a time when state base appropriations have declined by $738 million, or just under 30%. So as a system, we have directed resources, our base resources, to educating qualified students, and we have seen tremendous progress in all of our graduation rates within our institutions. Continuing base operating funds have been redirected to our key mission of educating students, but oftentimes this means less funding for facilities and infrastructure. I think nationwide, if we look at institutions, state institutions, private institutions that have had to redirect their resources, they have redirected resources into the key mission of the university. The key mission is educating students. It is not worrying about the grounds, the height of the hedges. It is not worrying about paint on the walls. But clearly, just like you would experience at home, if you don't do those things, we know that longer term, we are going to have some significant issues. And certainly that's one of the items that Chris talked about in terms of some of the big needs for PICO. Historically, PO&M funding, this is the funding for janitorial services, custodial services, grounds, utilities, preventative maintenance, minor repairs, etc., did not anticipate the increases in cost associated with technology, the technology revolution, if you will, and expanded business uses. There is no doubt that technology has contributed extensively to our cost structure on plant operations and maintenance. Not only in terms of the utilities, but also in terms of how we have to maintain our facilities. If you're looking at a Royal typewriter, maybe a little bit of dust is not that big of a deal, but when you're looking at sensitive scientific equipment, digital, electronic, we have to maintain the facilities in terms of custodial at a much higher level than we ever had to. Only since 1999, when the state university system revised its plant operations and maintenance budget process, did they reflect any adjustments in the usage of facilities as well as adjustments in cost. That is, if we're looking at a large lecture hall, a small classroom, a lecture hall, a research lab, etc., the new model recognizes that there are differences in how we have to maintain those facilities. And it also recognizes that there are changes in cost over time, the CPI, the PPI, etc. But that is only to PO&M dollars that we have received post-1999. The majority of our funds, the base budget PO&M, has never reflected dollars associated with the intensity of use, the type of use, as well as changes in cost in the marketplace. Clearly, we have tried to be efficient. This board has looked at the energy efficiency measures that have been undertaken over several years within each of our institutions. We always look for economies of scale. We look for innovation to lower the cost, but that can only go so far. In addition, we know that so many of our facilities are used literally on a 24/7 basis. I'm happy to report that as an undergraduate student, I was employed by the FSU Library in the Government Document section. This was before digital was even a word. The library generally closed at 9 o'clock. The Strozier Library at FSU today, like most of the other libraries in the state university system, are open 24/7 over expanded periods of time. The base model would have reflected maybe 8 or 10 hours worth of usage within that facility. It's not just the library, but computer labs, media centers all have extensive 24/7 use. And really, as an institution, we are 24/7 enterprises, and we encourage our students to be with us, learn, and teach 24/7. If we look at the adjustments to real dollars in funding over the past 10 years, PO&M costs have increased over 50%. That's an average annual increase of 4.2% per year. And this reduced real funding means that many routine maintenance items are foregone. And that leads us to the issue of deferred maintenance. Just like you've probably observed in your own neighborhoods with your friends, your families, yourselves, when it comes time to food on the table or fixing the leaky gutter or the leaky roof, it's going to be food on the table first. The other things will wait. The deferred maintenance, where we intentionally defer a routine maintenance item. We just don't do it because of other priorities. All falls outside of the traditional PO&M budget. We don't receive an allocation for deferred maintenance issues. This has resulted in postponed repairs and ignored preventative maintenance, producing critical deferred maintenance problems in buildings and utility infrastructure. This means we are exposed to increased safety hazards, higher future cost by foregoing things today at a lower cost, inefficient operations, mechanical breakdowns, and service interruptions. One element that is often overlooked because it is overlooked visually and that deals with our utility infrastructure, the things that are behind the scenes, the underground utilities, the electricity, the steam, the water, the sewer. In many cases, we have close to catastrophic issues with our utilities infrastructure. We must have dollars to support the deferred maintenance of those components. We just cannot afford to have a major breakdown, a major interruption that could last days or even weeks, depending upon the nature of the breakdown. Changes in facility utilization rates have exacerbated the deferred maintenance issue. I already talked about the 24/7 operations, but even in terms of how many students we are putting in classrooms, oftentimes it's the capacity of the classroom that dictates the utilization, as well as the hours of those basic classroom services. Chris had mentioned the best practice component of a building recovery reinvestment rate of 2 to 3%. And if you look at 2 to 3%, 2% in itself would suggest that the economic life or the useful life of a facility is 50 years. So you're going to recover over that 50-year period 2%. That's going to be the rate of depreciation or deterioration of that facility. Based upon the estimate of a physical plant equal to $14 billion, this would produce, at the lower end, a 50-year life, 2% a year, $280 million annually, just to maintain the current physical condition of our facilities. If we take it up to 420, which is really the best practice of 3%, it would be a much greater amount. And finally, the part dealing with the economic life of facilities, where the time period over which the improvements contribute to the value, or they meet the purpose intended. I mean, if you go back to the University of Bologna, if you go to Hogwarts, up through the state university system in the 80s, there really wasn't much change in how space was created, how space was used. But we all know, just walking around our own campuses, that there have been very significant changes to how university space is utilized. Peter Drucker, in 1997, made the following comments in an interview that was in Forbes magazine. He said, 30 years from now, the big university campuses will be relics. Universities won't survive as residential institutions. Today's buildings are hopelessly unsuited and totally unneeded. Now, part of this was made on the basis of distance learning that he felt would enable us to provide the classroom experience at a fraction of the current cost. Now, for those of us that have been involved in the distance learning enterprise, we know that it is anything but a fraction of the cost enterprise. And this goes along the lines of, the Y2K issue, where planes would be falling out of the sky and computers would not be working at the turn of the millennium, or that libraries would be relics themselves because of the digital media. I've already mentioned the fact that libraries are open 24/7, and it's not just to be open. Those libraries are open because the demand is there. We have changing needs of students and faculty in terms of how we deliver education, improvements in pedagogy. Thankfully, the recognized social learning environments, where even though we know college-age students, middle school children, elementary school children are all communicating via text and Twitter, etc., they still need, thankfully, that social learning environment where they get together. So go into any library today. You're not going to see the card catalog. I don't know that my children, who are, one graduated college, one's in college, has ever seen a card catalog. Okay? You used to have signs no talking. We encourage talking. We encourage that interaction. But those changes don't come for free. We recognize that we need to make them. But in order to renovate, to meet current taste, current preferences that meet the demands of a 21st century student and beyond, we need PICO to make those changes. We know what needs to be done. We know what enhancements have to take place. We need PICO to make that happen. So those are our key points. We could give you many others, but I think this covers the gist. We know that you are supportive. We know all of last session you worked very, very hard to bring in PICO dollars for the state university system. And we will, as I started off, be with you to provide the information that you need to make those decision makers understand the importance of PICO to the state university system, to the students, to the residents of the state, and the long-term economic viability of the state of Florida. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jessel. Let me just mention one thing, one question that I've got, and we talked about it the other day on the phone, and that is, we're in the process of our strategic planning. We know that the university system is growing and is going to continue to grow at pretty rapid rates. Chris, I think you mentioned to me that you thought the number not taken into effect, all the distance learning things that are going on, might be as much as 3 million square feet of new facilities are needed in the state every 5 years, which would relate to about 12 million square feet of new space in the next 20 years during that period of time. I guess my question to you would be, given that fact, given the fact that the state university's got to continue to grow, does the PICO revenue that are projected, is there enough bonding capacity there going forward in the next 20 years? Or granted that it's a guess, but I mean, what do you see given what you know now?
Sure, I'd be glad. And again, it is just a guess. My take, looking at the current forecast, which was based on the July numbers, there'll be a new forecast at the end of this month, and we'll see where we stand. You know, if the current forecast holds up, I would say it wouldn't get us all the way on the growth numbers, or all the way when you see that big number that Ken said, a best practice 3%, but we could get by. We could, continue to cobble things together, and we kind of kick the can down the road. We can grow a little bit. We can maintain some of our facilities. What I think we'll see more of is what Dr. Jessel is talking about, where we take an existing space, maybe we don't gut it down to the columns and redo all the wiring, do everything, but we spend a few $1 million to renovate it for the current teaching methodology and usage until times are better. So the universities have adopted a very, frugal approach. It's kind of, if I could put it in any better, it's like your couch is old, it's broken, you can't buy a new couch, maybe you throw a slipcover over it. Yeah, that's what the current forecast would support. It's reasonable. It's certainly not a gold-plated forecast, but that's if the forecasts hold with bonding. Without bonding, I think we'll see more and more space go from being unusable, unsatisfactory space. That percentage will go from 2 or 3% to who knows. 20 million a year doesn't cut it.
Well, and that won't give us the growth that we're projecting either, will it?
No growth.
Right. Okay. Any questions from the members of the committee? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Chris, I know we talked about this in our briefing, and you kind of half answered this, but on repairs and maintenance, I just feel very strongly we've got to keep up what we've got. This is business 101. We spent no money last year, right, on repairs and maintenance, basically.
For the up for this year, we're in now the 11-12 year. What's going to get us through this year, in all honesty, is some of those prior appropriations of infrastructure, taking the little fraction we got this year and the little bit that was still held back from the prior year. you know, as Ken would say, barring hurricanes, barring something
Right.
major, I don't think we'll have an institution that has to close down certainly the campus, close down a facility, not schedule. I think we'll get through this fiscal year, barely.
And then next year, you've got $22 million for repairs and maintenance, right, in our
Yeah,
budget.
that's what
that
I
we're talking about here today.
That's
What did we spend in the prior 2 years, like 8 and 9 or 9 and 10? So, and then how much, since we didn't get any money last year, how much of this $22 million, we kind of talked about this over the telephone, how much of this $22 million is kind of making up for last year?
I would say none of that $22 million is really making up for last year. Where we've made the difference as a board, and I think it's been so effective, it's been fairly invisible, that utility/infrastructure line in the PICO budget, which has ranged from, say, $50 million to as much as $100 million in some of those good years, and the board has always made that the top priority. That has supplemented that $22 million or $14 million. That's what the statutory formula comes up with, but this board recognized years ago that that was insufficient. So it's basically supplemented that dollars with, they've taken money out of projects and put it into utility, infrastructure, maintenance, renovation, remodeling. They kind of are basically not quite interchangeable, but for all practical purposes, yes. The board has been done that as a policy. When that funding disappeared, we went from having, say, total maybe 60, 80, 100 million plus for renovations. We're looking at now 14 or 20 million. And that's what I think has caused the concern of the CAFA group. They say, we can get by a little while, but not for long.
Well, the foresight is always, or hindsight is always 20/20, but I wish we'd have known it was going to be this bad when we approved all that money for Florida Polytechnic, but that's in the past, although there's expansion in the future. So the only thing I'd like to say, Dick, Mr. Chairman, is that clearly as we go forward, we got to finish projects that we started.
Yep.
We got to provide maintenance. We got to keep the roads and the roofs, and that, that's just crazy not to do that. And then we got to take a really hard look at new projects.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add one more comment to Governor Temple's question. Related to the deferred maintenance, it's important to remember that whatever we're putting together to hobble along doesn't deal with the issue of the critical deferred maintenance. Those many, many years where we had insufficient funding before the budget cuts, in addition to the exacerbated problem of deferred maintenance associated with the budget cuts. So that's really just enabling us to keep the facilities as they are without going in and doing the types of renovation and repairs on those items that we know we need to be doing, but just don't have the resources currently available to do so.
Right. Yeah, I think we all understand that in these times of very difficult, tight economics, we need to keep the buildings we have in as good a shape as we can afford to, or we're going to pay the price later. So I think we get that. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Madam Chair.
Mr. Chairman, I guess my thoughts are whether or not there is something that we can do kind of beyond being provided the information to try to help us in whatever way we can. And I don't know if there's an answer to this. I know that we've grown accustomed to relying upon PICO to ensure that we have a funding source to help our universities to grow. And it seems that the way things are going, we have kind of identified that if we don't have PICO, it's going to be a problem. But I'm not so sure, and maybe I missed this, that we talk about what we can do to kind of deal with it. I don't know. I mean, is the answer just what John said, that we just need to make sure that when we have money, we take care of what we had first and we stop building? Or are there other answers or other possible solutions that we should discuss as a board to deal with the issue? I don't know that. I'm asking a question.
Mr. Chandler.
First of all, the reality. We can have grand debates as a state about how much it costs to educate a student in terms of operational budgets and where that money should come from and in what percentage. How much students should pay in tuition, how much the state should contribute. And some of that gets down to philosophy, but it all centers around business at the end of the day. On this particular issue, there is no debate. The state university system has one source of revenue for the and I'm going to target right now just the maintenance issue. Okay, put new buildings in a box for just a minute. There is but one source of revenue to do this. It is not debatable. And that source, as Chris and Ken have eloquently demonstrated, is in peril. And unless there is something to take its place, we don't have the ability to find another source of revenue unilaterally out here, as we do by raising student tuition, or as we do by asking the state to put more in to supplement student tuition. So at the end of the day, to the chairwoman's good question, what do? I was contacted by the Senate prior to the beginning of the summer, and the legislature oftentimes does what are called interim studies, where they'll take an issue and their staff will then look at that issue and render some sort of a finalized study to the legislature for their consideration. And it could be on any issue. And I was asked by the Senate if we are interested in terms of an interim study for the state university system, and you could pick one issue, what would it be? The issue that I asked them to look at was the issue of PICO. Not only because it needs the study, and by the way, I've seen studies on PICO, and typically the studies that I've seen simply demonstrate what we already know, and that is the fact that there is one source of revenue and it's in trouble. Well, we know that. That's, to me, not a study. A study is what's the problem, but what are some possible solutions to the problem. And we are waiting right now to see, once released, the study done by the Senate. It's also important that it is coming from the Senate, because if we're looking for additional revenue on the issue of PICO, the legislature is our partner on this one. They're the one that's going to have to determine what the PICO stream or something akin to it is going to look like in the year's future. That won't be decided by this body or any other. That will be decided by the legislature. So we are very much waiting to see what their interim study looks like, and most importantly, not just a study of what we already know, but to see if they in fact come up with ideas as to how we might get our arms around this issue of PICO funding. Take it now back out of the box. Not only it is Business 101, John, you could not have said it better. Anybody knows, especially people who've run any sort of a large organization, that if you can't keep up the facilities you have, your entire operation is in terrible peril. So then you go to the issue of access. Classrooms and laboratories, and the ability to keep up the generation of baccalaureate degrees, master's degrees, and PhDs that we must to meet the growing demands of a state university system that is a growth system in itself. So I'm hoping, I'm not trying to put all my eggs in the basket of that interim study, Madam Chair. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I guess if there's good news here, the legislature understands this is a serious problem. Their investment, the state of Florida's investment, our buildings, are in peril, if not just the issue of new buildings to deal with access for Floridians for the future. So as soon as that study is released and we get our arms around it, we will report back to this committee and to the full board what kind of things we may be talking about to address your very good question. So what do we do? And I hope that what we find in that study gives us some good recommendations that we might be able to embrace and support going forward. I see the Commissioner down there. Commissioner, welcome. We're glad to have you. And as you can see, this doesn't just affect us. This is a huge issue for the Florida college system. This is a huge issue for the pre-K through 12 system as well. So.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? You know, my view is that we've got to do whatever we've got to do to protect the PICO funding that we've got and make sure we keep what we've got, and then look at what we can add to it, what we can add, what the legislature can give us and add to it. So it's on our radar screen, and we're focused on it.
It is. I should have said too. Pardon me, Mr. Chairman, but I should have said, because I always do with this one. It is triage, and in triage, you take the bleeders first.
Right.
And while I love building new buildings, did as a president, do as a chancellor, they're great. That issue of repairs and maintenance in a triage, that's our bleeder. And so coming from this board, and you have at least since I've arrived, I'm sure you did before that, we'll always make the repairs and maintenance issue our top priority, whether we have 10 cents or $100 million. It's got to be prioritized first toward deferred maintenance and the maintenance of our facilities.
Well, and that, in fact, what was done this time around, too. What you'll be looking at in a minute, that was the first priority on our list, even though it may not be enough. I'd like to call on Chris again. We've got to approve the public education capital outlay and the recommendations that will be in this committee's effort. And so I'd like to, Chris, can you walk us through?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go over briefly each of the 7 items in the fixed capital outlay legislative budget request, including PICO and the other programs, the Cortellis and the CITF debt service. I'll go over each attachment and then just stop me at any time, of course, members. The first is attachment 1. This is a non-prioritized look at PICO. We receive an allocation from the Department of Education, and within that allocation, staff makes recommendations on what should be funded following the board's adopted guidelines. And as we've discussed somewhat already, year 1, which is the most pressing year, the 12-13 year, we fund each university at 80% of what's been requested for utility infrastructure capital renewal roofs. We've then further tried to recommend restoration of all the projects that were in last year's budget that were vetoed. And the majority of these are projects that were continuation projects that are already under construction or ready to go to construction, just need this final balance of funds. That exhausts the 12-13 year, and of course this is based on those original, initial estimates. We'll have to have a new list again, probably at our next meeting in November. The 13-14 years, the next 2 years, look more normal in that we fully fund utility infrastructure as requested, we complete all projects, we finish up all vetoes, and we actually start planning and construction on the university's highest priorities of funding. At this point, however, as a staff person, those out-year forecasts are so uncertain, and the certainty of whether we'll continue the bonding of PICO is also very uncertain. So I take it more, the projects in those out years, as projects that have much merit, should bear careful consideration. To have any illusion that those are the dollars, the bottom line dollars we'll have in, say, the 14-15 year is not realistic. Whatever the number is, it's very unlikely to be exactly $347 million. I don't think we can see the future as clearly as we once could 5 or 6 years ago. So I'd be glad to take questions on any projects, but I think the most pressing ones are in the earlier period. That's attachment 1. Attachment 2.
Wait a minute, Chris.
Sir?
I'm
Chancellor
sorry,
has a
Chris.
question.
I just wanted to reemphasize, just in case anybody missed it, because what didn't come out on that slide were some of the words that were next to it. That slide demonstrates with the blue line bonded money, and that is if bonding is allowable. The green line is cash only. So that is the money we know we will receive. You can see where it is. The blue line represents money that we will receive if we are permitted to bond. So it's a big difference between the two. I just wanted to make sure, point of overemphasis, I suppose, that that's what that is supposed to show.
Which historically is what we've been doing for the last.
Right. This green dot, this year only was a cash only year. And yeah. If I may move on to attachment 2, this is the same list of projects as attachment 1, but this is a prioritized 3-year list. This is the list that we actually are required to submit as part of our legislative budget request. It requires a prioritized listing. The totals are slightly different because it includes some future year cost. We started the practice last year of providing the full future PICO funding need so that the board members can see the full cost of a facility and not just say if it's the final year, the final cost of a project. And then below the line we list the university's year one request, the 12-13 request, you can see we funded 80%, 100% would require $93 million if we funded it just as the university's requested. So that is the PICO. Well, there's one more piece of PICO. Attachment 3 is that formula PICO remodeling renovation that we had talked about extensively that does total $22 million, and it shows how much each institution would receive of that $22 million, which is allocated by a statutory formula. We follow the same formula on a K-20 basis. It's based on age of facilities and gross square footage. That's the PICO portion. Attachment 4 is our Cortellis list. It totals just a little under $100 million. It's $99.2 million in Cortellis. That number, the program has been suspended, but this is our final Cortellis list. We will continue to maintain this list until such time as the legislature is able to fund the Cortellis projects. So this is our final Cortellis list. It shouldn't change, barring some technical adjustment or if a donor should withdraw their Cortellis contribution. This number will not increase. Attachment 5 is the debt service on our capital improvement funds. Those are our student fee funds. This is for prior year debt service, which currently stands at $27.9 million. We did do a refunding last year and brought that down a little bit. So that's just a standard item to pay our debt service. Attachment 6 is projects that can be acquired from non-appropriated funds. These are typically projects that might be donated or acquired with university foundation funds. And then lastly is the list of projects that would be through debt. As you know, the board has been delegated authority under 10.10.62 to approve projects, parking, housing, etc. These are projects that do not fall within that delegated authority and require specific legislative authorization for the board to approve. It does not necessarily mean that the university will be bringing forward these projects at the time that they feel they are right for finance, and they will bring them forward for the full-blown board approval. This is just the routine legislative approval of projects that don't fit within a standard category of a garage, a dorm, housing, athletics of those nature. And with that, that is the 12-13 budget. And Mr. Chair, I'd be glad to entertain any questions.
I move approval of the fixed capital outlay legislative budget request.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Well, thank you very much, Chris. It looks like we've got our challenges ahead of us, for sure. I think we made the right decisions as it relates to the way we got to prioritizing the PICO list, including utilities and infrastructure, and then vetoed items, and then already funded projects underway, and then the last would be new. So I appreciate it very much. Yes?
The only thing I asked Mr. Chairman, and Chris and I have had some previous conversation about that, is that if for any reason it looks like we're headed closer to that green line than to the blue line, that is that if it looks like there's going to be some trouble with bonding, that we kind of can get that sooner than later, so we kind of can know how to respond to it. And a response may be some type of action on behalf of the board to do something, but just based upon our one-year history, if it looks like it's going to be green versus blue, then we need to know that as soon as we can, so we can advocate on behalf of the system.
I agree 100% with that. We'll do that. Thank you very much. Do we have any additional items to come before this committee? If not, the Facilities Committee is adjourned.
How are we doing on time? Mike, how are we doing on time?
We're right on time.
We're right on schedule, Madam Chair. I'm ready.
Sat down to me.